who claim discrimination in their home country are heading to the United States, right, where your administration is going to welcome them as refugees. Now, this comes as you've halted virtually all refugee admissions for people fleeing famine and war from countries like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why are you creating an expedited path into the country for Afghanis but not others?
Because they're being and we don't want to see people be. Now, South Africa leadership is coming to see me, I understand, sometime next week. And, we're supposed to have I guess a G20 meeting there or something. But we're having a G20 meeting. I don't know how we can go unless that situation's taken care of. But it's a that's taking place that you people don't want to write about. But it's a terrible thing that's taking place. And farmers are being. They happen to be white. But whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally and their land is being confiscated in South Africa. And the newspapers and the media, television media, doesn't even talk about it. If it were the other way around, they'd talk about it. That would be the only story they'd talk about. And I don't care who they are. I don't care about their race, their color. I don't care about their height, their weight. I don't care about anything. I just know that what's happening is terrible.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to know, there were many, from the BBC, there are many people who fit the criteria of seeking help, who are fleeing persecution. Afghans, for example, they live in a country run by the Taliban, but they're being denied refugee status. So I'm wondering, why has such an exception been made for the Afrikaans, especially when the South African government says they're not in danger? And are you going to open up the refugee settlement program for others?
Thank you for that question. I think you may recall that on the president's first day in office, on January 20th of this year, he issued an executive order that paused U.S. refugee programs that had been going at record levels under the prior administration and had brought in people that we were not sure had been carefully vetted for national security issues, and put a pause on the refugee admission program in general. That pause, of course, was subject from the very beginning to exceptions where it was determined that this would be in the interest of the United States. Some of the criteria are making sure that refugees did not pose any challenge to our national security and that they could be assimilated easily into our country. So the president on February 7th issued an executive order about the egregious conditions in South Africa, and all of these folks who have just come in today have been carefully vetted pursuant to our refugee standards. And whether or not the broader refugee programs for other people around the world will be lifted is still an ongoing consideration. But again, the president has recognized the dire situation of this particular group of people, and again, they went through the process.
And truth be told, I'm not a very big fan of the black people.
Hey guys, look, I just wanted to tap in really quick. I just got this feeling, man, that this summer is, it's about to be a white boy summer.
That's taking place that you people don't want to write about, but it's a terrible thing that's taking place. And farmers are being. They happen to be white, but whether they're white or black makes no difference to me. But white farmers are being brutally. Their land is being confiscated in South Africa. I don't care who they are. I don't care about their race, their color. I don't care about their height, their weight. I don't care about anything. I just know that what's happening is terrible.
But wait! There's more! Lands Act of 1913, subsequently named Bantu Land Act 1913 and Black Land Act 1913. Act number 27 of 1913 was an act of the Parliament of South Africa and was aimed at regulating the acquisition of land. It largely prohibited the sales of land from whites to blacks and vice versa. Economic interest, political influence, and racial prejudice were main contributors to the introduction of the Natives Lands Act. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Native Lands Act of 1913 defined less than 1/10 of South Africa as black reserves and prohibited any purchase or lease of land by blacks outside the reserves. The law also restricted the terms of tenure under which blacks could live on white-owned farms. 19th and early 20th centuries observed a junction of colonial imperialism, economic transformation, and the rise of racially divisive ideas. As European powers expanded their territories into Africa, the social identities of these regions were transformed. In 1853, the British Cape Colony introduced a colorblind electoral franchise, but in 1892, Cicely Rhodes got the Franchises and Ballots Act passed, which disenfranchised many black Africans by tripling the wealth requirement to vote. In 1894, the Glenn Gray Act was passed, beginning the segregation of races in South Africa through legislation. With the surplus of natural resources, including gold and diamonds, there was a rush to assert dominance in all regions of Africa. South Africa was introduced to a surplus of mainly British and Dutch immigrants who tried to implement their own ideologies upon the indigenous people of this land. Tensions began to grow between the colonizers and the indigenous groups throughout the 19th century, which ultimately led to the introduction of the Native Lands Act in 1913. Through this act, the colonizers were able to profit majorly the natural resources existing within the indigenous lands and the ability to use indigenous workers granted a lot of wealth. The act is remembered in South Africa history as one step towards the institutional discrimination and injustice of the apartheid era and for underlining geographic segregation of race that still remains. Other policies that followed the Native Lands Act included prohibition of interracial marriages, restricted access to many white-only spaces, creation of different public facilities, including bathrooms, water fountains, parks, and beaches. It is important to note that differently from other discriminatory systems, the apartheid system in South Africa was a white minority, discriminated against an indigenous black majority. Being the minority group, the apartheid government had to ensure they kept control of their power. The way the apartheid government was able to do this was through only allowing white people to vote and hold government positions, essentially making it impossible for them to be overthrown no matter how justly they acted. The Natives Land Act of 1913 was the first major piece of segregation legislation passed by the Union Parliament. It was replaced in 1991. The act decreed that blacks were not allowed to buy land from whites and vice versa. Exceptions had to be approved by the Governor General. The black areas left initially totaled around 7% of the entire landmass of the Union, which was later expanded to 13%. The act further prohibited the practice of serfdom and sharecropping. It also protected existing agreements or arrangements of land hired or leased by both parties. The land was in, quote, native reserve areas, which meant it was under communal tenure vested in Africa chiefs. It cannot be bought, sold, or used as surety. Outside of such areas, perhaps of even greater significance for black farmers, was the act forbade black tenant farming on white-owned land. Since so many black farmers were sharecroppers or labor tenants, that had a devastating effect, but its fully implementation was not immediate. The act strengthened the chiefs who were part of the state administration, but it forced many blacks in the, quote, white areas into wage labor. The act aimed at addressing issues related to serfdom or sharecropping, which had profound implications for indigenous people. It specifically prohibited these practices, which had been the primary source of employment for the indigenous population. Additionally, the legislation safeguarded existing agreements regarding land leased by both parties, particularly in designated, quote, native reserve areas. In these areas, land held under communal tenure vested in chiefs could neither be bought nor sold nor used as collateral. However, the impact extended beyond the designated reserve areas. The act also prohibited black tenant farming on white-owned land, a move that significantly affected many black farmers who were sharecroppers or labor tenants. The full implementation of these restrictions was not immediate, but when enforced, it compelled numerous black individuals living in, quote, white areas into wage labor, notably before the Native Land Act took effect. Much of the white-owned land was occupied by the indigenous people engaging in sharecropping arrangements. Indigenous individuals would rent the land for cultivation, sharing the resulting crops with the landowners. This mutually beneficial system drastically changed after the implementation of the act, as sharecropping and renting of white-owned land by indigenous people were banned. Instead of a partnership, the indigenous farmers had to work for their, quote, white masters. Consequently, this prohibition created severe challenges for the indigenous population, rendering them unable to work on the land they had previously cultivated, compounded by the forced relocation into poorly planned homelands and townships allocated strictly for indigenous groups. The act initiated a cycle of lasting poverty. The government's relocation efforts, coupled with the inability for the indigenous to find work and provide for themselves, led to a rapid increase in socioeconomic issues with these communities. Discrimination had prevailed prior to the Native Land Act, and majority of the damage was done prior to the act being enforced. The disposition of indigenous people in the land started when the European colonists first entered the land and started to expand their territory. They used many tactics such as annexation, warfare, and purchase of land. Oftentimes, indigenous leaders would accept these annexations and purchases because they realized that they were militarily outnumbered and warfare would not be beneficial for either party. Injustices against indigenous groups were prevalent. However, 1913 served as a catalyst for the institutional and more intense discrimination that followed. So all I'm saying is this. To go through all that information and to go through the two videos that I have posted on top of the other video I did directly on the Afrikaners coming directly here, everything has to do with race. It has to do with skin color. Because realistically, if we're to look at the whole totality and the history of South Africa and the many of years, the decades upon decades upon decades of which that the white Afrikaners, the Europeans, came directly there to steal land because they knew that there were resources there and that they can use those resources to enrich themselves because they escaped or quote unquote ran from wherever it is that they came from, because they didn't want to deal with the rule there. They didn't want to deal with the laws and everything else. They didn't just want to be standard issue. They wanted to cut out their own land. They wanted to make their own way, right? Away from quote unquote their parents, as a lot of people would like to say. And after all of these years and how all of the land has been redistributed and dispersed in between them and the indigenous folks, you have some issues that are taking place. And you have people all over the world, Caucasian, who now want to look at this situation and they want to weep. They want to cry. They'll be like, oh my God, how could this ever happen to the white farmers there? They didn't do anything wrong. This is crazy. This isn't human. This is barbaric. We have to do something. We have to save. That's crazy, because I'm like, when the Europeans came down there to Africa, nobody was trying to talk about save the indigenous people. Nobody was trying to sit up there and say that this is barbaric and it's wrong for Europeans to come, leave their country, run from their country into another country, and then make laws, rules, and regulations to solely benefit them to exile and take and steal away from the indigenous people. I didn't hear none of the communities around the world calling any of that out. Y'all just idly stood there and watched it and accepted, especially America. But now, because you got Trump directly in office, and by his side you have a South African, aka African American, by the name of Elon Musk, because of them and many others, now you have the leeway for these white South Africans to come directly over here to the United States to start anew. So not only did their people run from Europe down to Africa, 2 places, right? Now they're leaving Africa and coming directly to the United States. Crazy work. It's like no matter where they go, they always making it. They're always winning. They're the main ones that can always rewrite history, rewrite the tales. The main perpetrators that are currently here are now victims. And that's diabolical, because historically their families have always been stealing from the African people by way of land, by way of resources, mineral, whatever you want to sit up there and call it. That's all they've been doing. But here they are here in the United States, and they're the victims. They're being celebrated for stealing. They're being celebrated for being able to rewrite history again. That's crazy. But this is how it works. This is America. And if anybody wants to tell you that the whole reason that they're here is not because of their race, you might want to do your research, and you may want to look up a lot of stuff. But anyways, let me know what you guys think about this video and everything that I listed in the comment description below. And as always, peace, love, and stay tuned for the next video.